Thank you for joining me again for Bible Studies for Life Sunday School. And if you've been with us at all any of this time, you know we're looking at a fresh look at the Ten Commandments. So we are going to be in Exodus chapter 20. We're also going to be in, let me get there, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And the first few commandments were about our relationship with God. And now we're looking at our human interactions, our relationship with others. And today's command is to honor your marriage. And that's the title of the lesson today, Honor Marriage. And by the time that the Israelites had arrived at Mount Sinai, humans had experienced centuries of devastation from God's original design for marriage. Here at Mount Sinai, He gave them a key component of marriage, the seventh commandment, which prohibits adultery. Centuries after God gave this command, the greatest king of Israel disobeyed God, King David, and we'll look at that today also. The point that the writer wants to make, and it's in your books on page 46, is that physical intimacy is reserved for one man and one woman within the covenant of marriage. Now, if you have your book on page 46, the author starts to tell us about weddings, and he says that weddings come in all shapes and all sizes. Some are quiet and simple, and others create an experience that everyone will remember. Regardless of the wedding of anyone around us, they have one thing in common: union. And God calls this union a covenant. And a covenant is a spiritual binding. And today we'll look at that covenant, which is marriage. So if you have your Bibles or your books, Exodus chapter 20, verse 14 says, "Do not commit adultery." Now, in your book on page 47, I'm going to kind of quickly summarize what the writer of our book says. So if you have it, you can go ahead and pull it out. He says that we are to watch over our marriages and the marriages of others with all diligence. God has given us chemical bonds of romance that serve a greater purpose than mere pleasure. God has designed us in such a way that these chemical bonds create and seal ties of commitment, attraction, and protection based on various hormones. Well, adultery, which is the physical or whether it's physical or emotional, does far more damage than simply breaking trust. It transfers the marital bond in one partner to someone else. Science confirms this hormonal balance here, but God told us something very similar in His Word. When Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 6:16, "Don't you know that anyone joined to a prostitute is one body with her?" He used the Greek word, and I can't really pronounce it, but it's called Kollao with a long O, which literally means to glue together or to cement. So this adultery command here is really, it's for married couples. It's not for someone who's not married. There are other verses and other passages on that, but we don't want to get caught up in making the mistake of taking this out of context. It is for married couples here. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5:27-28, He goes a step further, and we kind of looked at that passage last week when we were talking about not murdering. So Jesus takes the commandments and He kind of breaks them down a little bit more. And I'm going to read that to you in Matthew chapter 5. Let me grab my Bible here. Lots of noise. Verse 27 and 28. "You have heard it said, 'Do not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So Jesus takes this command a step further, and He zeroes in on the heart that motivates the act. Our hearts is where the sin first takes root, and then it grows and it develops and we act on that sin. In James chapter 1, verse 14 and 15, I want to read you a verse about temptation. James says in James 1:14, I'm going to read verse 13. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So temptation in itself is not a sin, but it gives birth to sin when we don't flee from that temptation. Remember last week, Jesus' words in Matthew about murder. And he reminded us that anger and insults and name-calling, all those things dehumanize people. And it can lead to murder. But even if it doesn't lead to the act of murder, it leads to murder in our hearts because we have that thought process. Well, this week we've read in Matthew where Jesus takes this command of adultery even a step further, and he says that looking at a woman lustfully dehumanizes her. And this committing act of adultery, you do it in your heart when you begin to look at people like that. Now, I know that he talks about a woman here, but this can be a woman looking at a man in that way, or a woman looking at a man or a man looking at a woman in that way. When you look lustfully at someone with the intent of adultery, of sexual relationships or emotional relationships, then you commit this act in your heart prior to the physical act of it occurring. Now, the Greek word in this Matthew passage for look is blepo, and this means to look at or to gaze, to look for a long time with unwavering attention. So it's not that you glance, and we're going to look at this in the life of David, and you say, oh, okay, let me turn my head here, but it's the looking and gazing that can cause you to trip and fall into sin. And the Pharisees, they liked these check boxes. We kind of talked about this last week. They look at, oh, I haven't ever murdered anyone. Good, I'm good to go. Check that off my box. And the Pharisees, just like we can do if we're pretty legalistic we like laws and rules and we want something we can follow, instead of just listening to the Holy Spirit tell us, hey, that's not right, don't do that. If we start making up these checklists too much, then we fall into the heart temptations or the heart committing of a sin. And that's what Jesus addresses in Matthew chapter 5, where he's telling us it's not just about not committing an act, it's about not even going there in your mind or in your heart. So just like the Pharisees, we can look at this and say, oh, check, not committed adultery. And we can be focused on the literal law keeping. But Jesus makes a point in Matthew chapter 5. We need to keep ourselves not just from the act of adultery, but from our heart being wrong about that. Because just because you're keeping yourself from the actual act doesn't make you right with God. Now, let's look at 2 Samuel, and we'll kind of see this a little bit further in chapter 11, verses 1 through 3. In the spring, when kings march out to war, David sent Joab with his officers and all of Israel. They destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and strolled around on the roof of the palace. From the roof, he saw a woman bathing, a very beautiful woman. So David sent someone to inquire about her. This right here is an example of not guarding your thoughts or your heart. Faithfulness and purity begins in your mind. David saw Bathsheba, then he gazed on Bathsheba. And then he took it another step further and he sent somebody to inquire about her. So guarding his mind would have meant seeing Bathsheba and turning around and going back in the house. but instead, he chose to pursue her. The writer of your book says, if we don't guard our minds, we will share intimate knowledge about ourselves that only one person was meant to know. And that knowledge is significant. Now, going back even further in marriage was Genesis chapter 4, verse 1. The writer of your commentary that wrote the Lifeway series made this point, and I thought it was very good. He says, Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 reads, the man was intimate with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. Now, the original term was intimate is totally different than she conceived. This term was intimate does not refer to a sexual relationship. It's the Hebrew word yada, Y-A-D-A, and it means knowing or revealing something. So it's not just sexual intimacy. This context points to an intimate knowledge. The writer says, it's clear that sexual intimacy is about so much more than physical activity and pleasure. Yada is the idea of plummeting into the reality of another person in order to know deeply and be deeply known. So sometimes adultery, as Jesus referred to it in Matthew chapter 5, is not just the physical act of adultery. It's going there in your mind or going there emotionally with someone. It's jumping in the boat, so to speak, and you're alone and you're transferring thoughts and intimate knowledge that you should only be sharing with your mate, your spouse, your husband, or your wife. So, kind of sticking to 2 Samuel here, part of gazing or going after can be doing that in your mind. Now, granted, David has not taken this step all the way yet, and we're going to see in just a minute where he does. But right now, he's contemplating it. He's thinking about it. And this is where he should stop. Now, in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3 to 5, we're going to read on. And he said, isn't this Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite? David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to him, he slept with her. Now she had just been purifying herself from her uncleanness. Afterward, she returned home. The woman conceived and sent word to inform David, I am pregnant. And I'm reading all this out of your actual book. The Holman Christian Standard is what it's written in. Here in these verses, David failed to honor not only himself, but Bathsheba's marriage and her relationship. The servant tried to intervene. He spoke up right here in this first verse, verse 3, and you can actually read the beginning of verse 3 where we just left off in the previous verses. This servant tried to work out this on Bathsheba's behalf and tried to kind of stop David in his tracks. And he reminded David, he was trying to get him not to pursue Bathsheba, first of all. And then he told David, hey, this is somebody's daughter, remember? This is Eliam's, the daughter of Eliam. And then he reminds him that this is also Uriah's wife. Like, you're pursuing this lady, but she's somebody's daughter, she's somebody's wife, and you need to kind of go ahead and stop it and nip it right there. But he pursued her anyway, regardless of the consequences. He wasn't just affecting himself, he was affecting Bathsheba and her family and the future of all of them. The writer of the commentary says, when sex becomes nothing more than an activity to be performed, it brings heartbreak, jealousy, regret, and a host of emotional, physical, and spiritual consequences. Guarding your marriage from adultery starts by both spouses cultivating a relationship with one another. Now, if that relationship is not cultivated and it's not there, there's still no excuse for going and looking for it somewhere else. However, that is one way, that is the first way to stop the thoughts or the dwelling on of an outside relationship. Cultivate your love, cultivate your honor, and cultivate your romance with your marital partner. Here in these verses, we see that David failed to guard his own heart, and he also failed to guard Bathsheba's heart. And we saw that where the servant did try to intervene and stop him, reminding him of all these consequences. And sometimes we have friends, I hope you have friends, that can remind you of consequences, whether it's with adulterous relationships or just with anything else. Those are the friends you need to have, who are going to stand for you even when they're not standing with you in what your pursuit might be. So when David pursued this relationship, he invited calamity into his own life, into his family's life, into Bathsheba's life, and into Bathsheba's family's life. So it was a whole lot more involved than just this pursuit of sexual pleasure, which is what he thought he was getting. So the question is, how can you honor marriage? If we're supposed to not commit adultery, then how can we honor marriage? And there's a few applications that the writer of the book posed in your book, and that is going to be found on page 52 if you have that. And the first thing he says that we can do is examine our hearts. Honor for your marriage and other people's marriages will begin in your mind. What do you think about marriage? How do you view marriage? And he says too, to turn from lust, pornography, inappropriate feelings for other people, inappropriate desires for other people. And the second thing he says to do is examine your actions, not just your heart, but your actions. If you are guilty of any of these things, then repent and turn away from them. And go to someone you trust, or go to a counselor and get some help if that's the next step, if that's what you need to do. If you're not guilty of these things, thank God. Too often, these things are happening and these things are prevalent, and we need to be very thankful if it's not happening in your own life. But ask God to continue to preserve you and your marriage if it's not going on. And then if it is going on in some other friend or someone you engage with on a regular basis, if you know these things are going on, pray for them and be that servant and stick up and remind them of the consequences of these actions. Just like the servant tried to stop David, you can't stop it if they continue to pursue it. You can't be the police and, spin around in your car and try to completely stop the situation. It's ultimately their decision and their choice. But you can be a mediator and you can be that voice. So do that if and when you can. And the third thing is honor. Seek ways to honor your marriage and honor other people's marriages. Our thoughts can ultimately lead to actions. So one way we honor our marriage is to keep our thoughts pure. N.T. Wright says that kingdom life is more than just keeping rules. It's about the attitude of your heart. And that's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. He reminds us, this is more than just stopping murder. And this is more than just stopping at adultery. This is a heart process. This is a thinking, a way of communication. This is speaking the right words as far as the murder goes, and keeping your mouth pure, because you can murder someone with your tongue. This, in this case, is keeping your thoughts pure about your own spouse and about your own relationship, and turning away from these desires that you may have. And if you'll continue reading in that passage in Matthew chapter 5, it's grouped right there with the adultery passage. 27 and 28 talk about adultery being in your heart. And then 29 and 30, I'm going to read to you right before we close, because this was kind of not just about adultery. This was just a great reminder in general. Matthew 5, 29 and 30 reads this. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. He says, if your eye's going to cause you to sin, don't look. If your foot is going to cause you to sin, don't go. And if your hand is going to cause you to sin, don't do it. Thanks for listening to this difficult lesson, just like last week was on murder. This week was on adultery, and these are just hard things, especially when you realize this is not just, oh, check the box, I didn't do that. Check the box, I didn't do that. These are things that start in your heart and your mind, and these are things that are going on with your friends around you, and just a great thing in the church right now as well. So look for ways you can honor marriage. And next week, we're going to be looking at how we can honor all relationships, and how integrity and commitment in Jesus is the foundation for these relationships. Thanks for listening. See you next week.